Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3, the committee is undertaking its consideration of the Canadian Early Learning and Childcare System of the 2025 fall report of the Auditor General of Canada sent to the committee on October 21st, 2025.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, nice to see you again, back before us again, the Auditor General of Canada, Gabrielle Lombardi, Principal, and Eva Jarzina, Director. Nice to see you as well. From the Department of Employment and Social Development, Paul Thompson, Deputy Minister, thank you for coming in today, along with your colleague, Catherine Adams, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Income Security and Social Development. I believe you'll each have 5 minutes or approximately 5 minutes opening statement. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor to kick us off, please.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie de nous donner l'occasion de...
I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity for appearing today to discuss our report on the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, which was tabled on October 21st. First of all, I would like to say that we acknowledge the fact that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. In our audit, we examined whether or not ESDC met its responsibilities with respect to child care and early learning. The government committed to sending $36 million to the provinces, territories, and to the Indigenous partners to support the creation of high-quality, affordable, inclusive, and flexible spaces in the service of the early learning and child care system. During the first years of the agreement, the provinces and territories spent $12 billion of the $15 billion that were sent to them.
Parents' out-of-pocket fees for federally funded spaces had been reduced to an average of $16.50 a day. The target is to reach an average of $10 per day by March 2026. Federal funding also supported the creation of approximately 112,000 new child care spaces as of March 2024. However, with time running out, there is a risk that the goal of creating 250,000 new spaces by 2026 will not be met. The audit found that the department lacked information to track whether federal funding had met the objectives of supporting diverse and vulnerable children and families and supporting Indigenous early learning and childcare initiatives. For example, the department could not report about progress achieved on initiatives for Indigenous early learning and childcare, such as facility renovations or repairs. While childcare costs to parents have been reduced, Employment and Social Development Canada's monitoring is not sufficient to know whether families' needs are being met. The department needs to collect consistent and comparable data across the country to track the program's overall performance, inform future decisions, and support families across Canada. Monitoring is also essential to assess the financial sustainability of the Canada-wide system going forward. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Thompson, if you have an opening statement, approximately 5 minutes, and whatever you need. Thank you.
Very good. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Start by commending the Auditor General and her team for a thorough and thoughtful analysis of the early learning and childcare program in Canada. The report appropriately captures some of the progress achieved through the early learning childcare system and accurately reflects a number of the challenges that we've had in rolling the program out, and in so doing makes some very important recommendations. I want to assure the committee that my department is already working to address and implement the recommendations in the report. La mise sur pied d'un système d'apprentissage.
The setting up of a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system is a vision that is for all families to have access to high-quality, affordable, flexible, and inclusive early learning and childcare, no matter where they live. In its report, the Auditor General found that families are seeing improvement in affordability. They found also that all provincial and territorial governments had reduced average out-of-pocket fees by 50% by December 22 for regulated spaces, part of the Canada-wide program.
24, 5 provinces and 3 territories reported achieving an average fee of $10 per day. This brought the average fees paid throughout Canada for full-time childcare to approximately $16.50. However, the report also found that the target to create 250,000 new early learning and childcare spaces by March 2026 was at risk. The deadline for space creation target is, as stated, next year, and we continue to work with our provincial and territorial partners to achieve it. When the Government of Canada announced its intention to create an early learning and childcare system in 2021, it was clear that there were 2 issues at the forefront: affordability and access. Comme l'indique le rapport de la vérification.
As reflected in the Auditor General's report, our work with provinces and territories has already resulted in significant savings for families across the country, but increasing capacity through space creation has been moving at a slower pace.
Is that unlike fee reductions, which is a question of providing funding, the creation of spaces takes greater time. It involves complex multi-year projects, the development and support of the workforce. That is why, in many cases, provincial and territorial action plans reflect a more gradual ramping up of the space creation goals, having first addressed some issues of affordability. The space creation goals are more heavily weighted in the last 2 years of the agreements. The Auditor General also identified that ESDC's reporting has not been timely, in part due to the necessity to both receive and review the information from our partners. Openness, transparency, and accountability are guiding principles, and as Deputy Minister, I agree with the AG that proper data collection and reporting on the system is vital to ensuring that the program remains responsive to evolving needs. There's no question that more work is needed to improve our reporting practices, which is why we are in constant dialogue with our partners to strengthen and better communicate the progress. As an example, we have been co-developing results frameworks with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners to improve how we measure collective outcomes for Indigenous early learning and childcare. Furthermore, in March 2024, the Canada Early Learn Childcare Act received royal assent. This legislation includes a requirement that the Minister deliver annual reports to Parliament on federal investments and the progress being made under a Canada-wide system. With that, I would again like to thank the Auditor General and her office for the report and the recommendations, which is helping us guide the work forward on improving Canada-wide early learning and childcare.
Thank you both very much. We'll now begin with our first round, which will consist of 3 members, 6 minutes each. Ms. Goodridge, nice to see you here today. You will kick us off, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you.
Ms. Goodridge, I'll let you know as a guest, when your time expires, if the witnesses are still answering the question, I do let them finish. You just can't interrupt them once your time has expired, but you will have your full 6 minutes and a few extras if you time it wisely. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. This is a very important topic, and I think that this is something that a lot of families have benefited from. So, in your report, Ms. Hogan, you highlighted the fact that there was a risk of not getting the space creation. Are you confident, based on the information you were able to assess, that all of the spaces that were created were net new spaces?
Mm-hmm. So, that was a challenge, and that's why we talk about it being a risk, that that the target of 250,000 new spaces won't be met. The federal government just has the information that's provided to it by provinces and territories, and there isn't clear parameters on exactly what to report back. There could be some that are not net new. There could be some that are created that just not used or taken up because there isn't staff for those spaces to be created. And I think this speaks to one of our key recommendations is why better gathering of data to be able to compare across the country, apples to apples, is definitely needed. But when we look at how many spaces were created in year 3, while I recognize it's likely going to be back-end loaded, there's a lot of work left to be done.
Well, like I know in my province of Alberta, there were day homes, and a lot of them were unregulated. And so basically we created regulated spaces, which an unregulated day home could have 5 kids, a regulated day home can have 6. So that's a creation of one space. But I believe in this agreement, and perhaps Mr. Thompson, you could give us some information on this. Did that count as 6 spaces or 1 space in a situation like that?
Catherine, do you want to?
So if, in that case of a private home care provider, if they moved into the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system and added a new space, I believe that would be counted as 6 new spaces created because they're coming into the Canada-wide system. And by that, they're then abiding by the guidelines that the province has agreed to around affordability.
So then, Ms. Hogan, I guess this opens up a big question of like, if that's the case, that there were already 5 spaces, and by moving them from one system into another system, now they count them as 6 new spaces, but technically there were 5 spaces. Is that not like really funky math?
So I think it's important to step back and say, childcare is regulated by the provinces, and then there is unregulated spaces and regulated spaces. And all the federal government can gain access to is information on regulated spaces. And so there are certain rules, and you're going to have certain rigor and improving quality. And the goal of this program was to increase affordable quality, flexible spaces. And so, yes, it would be bringing in new spaces. I agree if I was a parent, I would say, well, there isn't 6 new spaces there, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of being able to show whether or not this funding is really meeting the net objective of creating 50,000 new spaces. Right?
So then my next question is, in your report, you talked about the fact that there were provinces that were using school-aged kids. Can you elaborate on which province or provinces were using school-aged children as part of their counts?
So there was, we mentioned that about one province. I believe it was the province of Saskatchewan. And I think in this case, what they were told was the space is occupied by someone over the age of 6, but eventually when that person is no longer in that space, we'll redirect it. But this is why you need to set out the parameters with provinces and territories at the outset. What are we going to count? What are we all going to agree is a new space under this program, so that you're reporting accurate and comparable information nationally?
Well, and I think that's so critically important. And I'm a parent of 2 young kids. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and we rely on childcare. And I think a lot of parents feel completely gaslit because they have access to wait lists. They don't actually have access to childcare in so many provinces across this country. And the federal government goes out and says, this is such a huge success. We've done such an amazing job. We've created all these spaces. And they're sitting there going, no, this day home that I used to go to, it's just now regulated, and so there's 1 more space. That's not 6 new spaces. That's 1 new space. And when we hear things like some provinces are using that because the information from the federal government wasn't clear, well, perhaps this was a case where the federal government should have left provincial jurisdiction alone and worked with provinces to create a program rather than imposing a program on a province. But that's just my little soapbox that I'll get off of. So my question on the Saskatchewan piece, how many students were counted in that?
So I'm going to have to see if someone can give us that level of detail. I think the only comment I would make as they're searching for that information would be that the agreement to develop the Canada-wide early learning was a collaborative agreement. So provinces and territories contributed to what the 5 goals would be. And one of the conditions of accessing funding federally would be to provide information. And all I can point out is that the federal government should have set themselves up better to get comparable and consistent information. So I'm just going to see if someone can give you that answer.
I want to.
Do you want that answer?
One more quick question on this. Are we also counting how many spaces closed as a result of this? Are we tracking any of that?
And Ms. Goodrich's time is up. I will let you answer both those questions if you like. Thank you.
You're not on.
Oh, I have to press it myself?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the question. So very briefly, it comes down to the wording in the agreements, and some agreements specified that the space creation targets were net new, and some did not specify. So the measurement of what was reported against those objectives can kind of be a mixed bag of things. And for the Saskatchewan example, it was an estimated number of spaces because about a quarter of the family home spaces in Saskatchewan are for school-age children. So that shouldn't have been counted depending on how you define the parameters of new space creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next is Mr. Osborne. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in full disclosure, I will say that I was the Minister of Education in Newfoundland and Labrador when we signed the agreement and started on this process. So I will say that there is a huge benefit to transferring unregulated spaces to regulated. If they're unregulated, we can't measure the quality. And we had a huge concern in Newfoundland and Labrador, not with all unregulated. Some of them were fantastic operations and did a great job, but some of the unregulated did not. So to transfer a space from unregulated to regulated, I think deserves some merit in counting that, because now you can you know the quality. There's a set of criteria they must follow. I'm just wondering if Ms. Adam or Mr. Thompson want to speak to that for a moment.
Sure, I can start out. It was indeed our objective to expand the regulated childcare space as an assurance of quality, that the province has a degree of oversight in terms of the quality of the care being provided. And that, when we went into the program, we had a benchmark of approximately 908,000 existing regulated spaces across the country, and that was the mark from which we were trying to grow by 250,000 regulated spaces. It could indeed be the case that there's spaces converting from non-regulated, but similarly, we're not tracking the growth of the non-regulated space either, so it's possible that they've been backfilled by other non-regulated spaces as well. The program here is an investment to grow the regulated space with the greater degree of quality assurance. I don't know if Catherine wants to add anything to that. You're good?
Nope, I think that's great.
So I guess the second point that I will make is, I know in Newfoundland and Labrador, when we transferred unregulated spaces to regulated, and they took advantage of the $10 a day, they went from $25 or $30 or $40 a day to $10 a day. So there's another benefit to going from unregulated to regulated. I'll leave that at that for a moment. When we signed the agreement, I mean, we had gone from whatever the price was. In some cases, it was $40 or $45. Some cases, it was $60 or $70 a day. We had initially gone to $25 a day and then $10 a day. I will say that the number of spaces in Newfoundland and Labrador has increased significantly, not nearly where it needs to be yet, but it is growing. As costs go down, demand goes up, and that created some issues with unmet demand. When we'd gone to $25 a day, we saw a huge increase in demand. Going to $10 a day, that demand grew exponentially. So there may be more people on the waiting list, but the demand is there because families who could not afford $50 a day can afford 10, so they're now on a list. But the number of spaces also grew. I understand, having signed the agreement and the objectives of the agreement, the growth is more heavily weighted in year 3 and 4 because you, as we say in Newfoundland, you can't knit an early childhood educator. They have to be educated, and that takes 2 years. So while we were less than half of the spaces that, you know, were forecast, or, you know, the goal, I do feel, and I'll ask you to speak to what the likelihood of meeting that 250,000 spaces is, but I understand that that growth happens as early childhood educators are educated.
So we are automatically okay. We are optimistic that the last year of the agreement will be the biggest year in terms of space creation. It's too early to say whether the target will be met or not, but we're working very hard towards that. We definitely have seen the dynamic that you referred to as you lower the price of childcare. Demand has significantly increased. One of the constraints in increasing capacity has indeed been the supply of early childhood educators, but we have seen significant labor force growth in that space, almost 30% growth in the number of early childhood educators since 2021 when the program was launched. So that's a positive sign in terms of capacity gradually coming on strength that will enable expansion, not only expansion, but better utilization also of the expanded spaces. No point expanding a space if you don't have the staff to operate it. So those two have to work in tandem, and there's been emphasis on both.
So I will go on. I know the AG report has found that affordability has improved and the pay and training. And part of this was to also see early childhood educators, recognize them for what they do. If I'm putting my children into early childhood education, I am trusting that they will prepare my children for the K-12 system. So I am calling it early childhood education because it's not just childcare, it is early childhood education. So having the system more regulated, more professional, having the professionals that educate our children and prepare them for school means that they should be paid more than what they were. And I think there's been huge success in that as well. Just wondering if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. This has been a big part of the effort as well. It's affordability, it's space creation, but it's also quality. And one of the ways to underpin quality is the quality of the workforce and the competencies and training, but also the wages. We've worked with provinces to encourage the development of wage grids. So 10 of 13 jurisdictions now have a wage grid where early childhood educators can progress their salary with different levels of experience. A bit earlier days in terms of other benefits, but pleased to see that 3 of 13 have pension programs in place, 4 of 13 have benefit programs in place. So those kinds of measures are critical to attracting and retaining the talent that's needed to assure the quality, and we continue to work with provinces on other aspects of quality assurance for the system as well. But a core part of it is the quality of the workforce and the associated salaries.
Thank you. I'm afraid that is your time, Mr. Osborne. Suivant up next, c'est Monsieur Lemire pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Thompson. Child care is a provincial responsibility. In 1987, the Premier of Quebec created these centers of excellence for early childhood excellence for children of age 4, and then even earlier than that, a little later on. It's been an incredible success, but he was a pioneer. Why then have the other provinces waited so long to do something very similar? Well, thank you for your question. It's true that the model in Quebec certainly is an inspiration for the program with respect to investment and the benefits for family, the impacts on the labor market. There has been a true spin-off for these investments in Quebec. And as you know, I think, we have an asymmetric model with respect to Quebec. The flexibility that is there and the knowledge of the progress that is made has already been achieved in Quebec. That is the goal for us to further invest and to improve the system throughout Canada using the Quebec model. That's where we draw our inspiration from. Now, with respect to the provinces, the model provides a great deal of flexibility to the provinces. There are many aspects that are under the control of the provinces and the territories. They have overall goals and objectives. with respect to the results of the investment, but the details on the ground are in fact the responsibility of the provincial programs, the territorial programs. Well, Quebec has this wonderful history of what it has done, and there has been transfers of monies. What I note is this, though, is that the federal government continues to want to insert itself in provincial politics and provincial policies. There are fewer projects that are built. The rules that are different, say, in Ontario than in Quebec, with respect to the way in which the services are dispensed in childcare. So if you transfer the monies directly to the provinces, they are spent wisely. And in fact, there's been great success, as you say, in Quebec in 2021. Targets changed in Quebec. There was a target of $10 a day. But at present, according to March 24, it was $16.50 per space. So how can you explain this spread between the two costs for spaces in our province and the others? Thank you. With respect to the first part, I would say that it is up to the provinces to deal with the specifics as to the administration of the costs for the childcare spaces. And you also have the geography of the investment. There are provinces that know their needs, best know their needs. With respect to progress, clearly, it has become evident that there has been a lot of pressure on the system, the level of inflation, the cost of spaces has increased, and also the cost of operating the system, the childcare system has increased, and that is the reason why we are at $16.50 rather than $10 a day. Well, for me, this program is a success, particularly in Quebec, because the monies that were transferred, rather than, as is the case in dental care, where you have billions of dollars that is distributed by essentially checks. And so there's a loss, in a sense, of trust in the province's ability to do what it does best. Now, how much would that cost in terms of administration for the child care program? Are you asking about the federal government or the overall cost? Well, for our department, well, we have a secretariat that is responsible for receiving and analyzing data from each province, from their reports, and it is our bargaining team. We are currently negotiating with the three remaining provinces to establish agreements. But it's a figure that is very easy to find, but I don't have it with me now. Well, can you put it in writing and send it to the committee? The federal government has signed an agreement until 2031 with respect to this. What's going to happen to the other provinces? Are the daycare systems going to, childcare systems going to remain or not? I'll give the floor back to my colleague who can speak to this. The question was, is there something that you are seeing in the future as a mechanism? Because the funding is there till 2031, and then the federal government is going to withdraw. What does that mean for jurisdictions? There is an act that was presented in Parliament, and we have a commitment from the government to continue with its investments. But doubtless, there are always unexpected possibilities. We do have examples that can reassure us that the system, even if it was truly new, would work. It would work. It gives us the opportunity and the chance to families, if they want to use the system, to truly have a space in a childcare place, which gives a family the opportunity to operate their own budget. It's less expensive. They can participate without wondering, it's really an economic policy that is helping families. So I feel that the government has really expressed an intention to continue with the system. Doubtless, there are improvements that can be made. Progress will continue to be made. But I have to say we really do have a significant investment. That's it. I have a passion for this program.
Deuxième tour. Madame Kuzi, Ms. Kuzi, you'll have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Hogan, your report showed that between 2020 and 2023, the number of parents who reported difficulty finding care for their children had increased by more than 30%. This difficulty came after the program had commenced. My colleague had provided his insight as to why he thinks this might possibly have been, but I wanted to ask you directly, why do you think that this occurred, this dramatic increase after the commencement of the program?
Well, I mean, I can simply speculate here because the federal government hadn't really gathered information about whether the new spaces were actually being used or not used and what were the root causes. In fact, they went to Statistics Canada in order to go get that. I think I would start off by saying that when you raise costs, obviously increased demand is going to be there. And that Statistics Canada survey did highlight that many people were saying that the new spaces created either didn't meet the needs of their children if they had special needs, that the timing didn't fit their work schedule, or that the space wasn't available in their community. So I think this speaks to the need of having the provinces provide information federally so that they can have a better picture about it's not simply about creating spaces, but it's about creating them where the need exists and helping influence how that can be so that you can speak nationally to whether or not it's meeting the needs of families.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan. And with that, I'll go to Mr. Thompson. As the Auditor General indicated, outside of Statistics Canada, your department didn't properly track or assess data. Can you tell us, please, how many families are currently on wait lists?
That, unfortunately, is a data gap in the system. Provinces do not maintain, most provinces do not maintain centralized waiting lists. So the individual providers would have their individual wait lists, but that would include duplication of a lot of names. So this is one of a number of issues that where we fully agree with the AG's recommendations, and we have work underway with provinces to provide better reporting. In fact, we've just launched a portal a week ago, which will provide more timely and accurate information on the progress being made in space creation. And we're going to continue to work with provinces as they upgrade their ability to report to citizens within each province and territory.
Ms. Hogan, do you believe if the government was following through on its own agreements and ensuring the guiding principles were being met, that wait list would be shrinking and not growing by 32%, as you noted? We're hearing about the will to have these things, but are the things, should the government have included within the agreements more benchmarks, if you will, or anchors, as we've come to call them financially, to ensure that the spaces are being created in an effort to receive the funding?
I mean, I think that's one of, we issued 3 recommendations, and that's probably one of the most key ones, right? If you want to be able to show that Canadian funds met the objectives of this program, you should set yourself up at the front end to gather all that information. And there are some really important gaps. the agreements call for that kind of information sharing. So now you need to sit down with the provinces and territories. There needs to be will on both sides to be able to gather, ability to gather, and then willingness to share. But then when the federal government does get it, so in some cases we see they're not getting some information, but when they are getting the information, they're not consolidating it in order to give a global portrait for what they might already have. So I think there's some work to be done on both sides, but this is something that should be thought of at the start of the creation of a program. What do we want to measure and how do we plan on getting there? But also making sure that you have certain milestones a few years in order to show progress so that you can keep pushing towards the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that perhaps the disbursement of funds should be contingent upon these types of things. But again, I just find this completely ironic on the day that we were supposed to hear the announcement of an MOU with my province, the lack of details which surround these things. And this is, in fact, one of the flagship pieces of this government, which is, of course, the continuity of Prime Minister Trudeau. And so what I'm hearing you say, which is consistent with what they have done and what I expect they will do today, is just sort of announce things, put things in place without really doing the hard work of determining the data, the necessity, the requirements for implementation, or as we've seen here with ESDC, the follow-up for it. Ms. Hogan, you mentioned that we're seeing parents who work shift work or live in rural, remote communities not being offered limited opportunities. Pardon me, I'll turn this to Mr. Thompson. What concrete actions have you taken to make the program more accessible and more open to parents that don't work 9 to 5 in an urban center, please?
Well, this is an objective that the provinces have signed off on to make a service offering that is responsive to the needs in their own jurisdiction. So obviously the federal government doesn't determine the allocation within a province to different centres. This is certainly a known area with our provincial colleagues, and they're endeavoring to try to make that type of service available, but it's really outside of the federal government's authority to allocate specifically within a province to meet those specific needs, but there's a shared objective to do so.
Thank you. That is your time. Mr. Housefather, you're next, please, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and I actually think that the report generally shows this program has been a pretty big success. I mean, it's created regulated daycare spaces, over 112,000 up to last year, early last year, that likely wouldn't have been created otherwise, which entitles parents to find cheaper and more guaranteed quality spaces for their kids and systems. Ms. Hogan, do you have any reason to believe that if the federal government had not created this program, those spaces would have been created?
I wish I had a crystal ball that I could tell you what would have happened. But what I can tell you is that there was a clear agreement across the entire country that making spaces more affordable was needed, and the federal funding has supported that. We have seen concerns around the long-term fiscal sustainability of this going on beyond 2026, but it's clear that it is supported meeting some of these objectives. But the federal government has a long way to go on being able to demonstrate all of those objectives being met, right?
Yeah.
The act had more than just affordability in it.
Of course, I completely agree. But the question again of everybody just remaining, in provinces being left to do whatever they want with respect to daycare, it's likely that these spaces wouldn't have been created. I mean, you're looking at an innovative program that one province did and exporting it across the country with the aid of the federal government, but leaving provinces within their jurisdictions to have flexibility with respect to how the programs are managed. And they're having the right to sign or not sign agreements with the federal government if they didn't want to have the program. And I think that's an important thing. But let me come to another question, because I do think it's a fair point that was raised. Mr. Thompson, I like to ask a lot about contracts and about the terms of contracts. What were the terms in these agreements, in the presumably template agreement that we started with, obviously negotiating with each province with respect to reporting, and why was it difficult to have reporting initially? Because I assume all of the provinces started from a different place with respect to the information they had available and the creation of systems that would allow them to know such things as whether or not they had a wait list. So can you talk to me about what we initially asked for as a federal government and what the negotiation process was with respect to the different provinces on that point, on data collection?
First of all, it was a complex undertaking, starting a system from a patchwork of different programs that existed. So the starting point in each jurisdiction was quite different. And as a result of that, we did our best to tailor agreements to some of the provincial circumstances. So it wasn't a carbon copy in each single province. There was a bit of customization to match the circumstances, which made it a little bit more complex, but it was an effort to try to recognize these different starting points. Maybe if I could, just commenting on your question to the Auditor General, one additional benefit on top of the federal investment is it's been a catalyst for provinces to invest significantly as well. So alongside the additional federal investments, we've seen a very significant increase in parallel by provinces and territories. So the investments are working in tandem to increase the spaces, which are now, as of November, at 125,000 spaces created, the very last number. So space creation has benefited from both the federal and provincial investments. I don't know, Catherine, do you want to say anything more about the terms and conditions of the different agreements? You were a bit closer to some of the negotiations.
It's a few years ago, but yeah, each province had a different starting point, but we needed to have common indicators and common areas that all provinces reported on. For some jurisdictions, it was a much easier goal for them to achieve. They had more robust, mature systems in terms of the kind of data they already collected. Other provinces and territories, it was a bit more nascent. So being able to negotiate, both recognizing where each individual jurisdiction was from to get to a common set of indicators that we could have province report on, took time. And it also necessitated some degree of flexibility about when and how data could come into us. Overall, though, the jurisdictions, all 13 jurisdictions, have agreed on the importance of quality data. They committed to that within their agreements. And we have a federal, provincial, territorial data working group that has just recently been convened and is beginning to really dig in to make sure there's a common understanding and help being shared across the country for jurisdictions to be able to meet the reporting needs on data. Let's
ask one other question then. When the objectives are, when they get to whatever the growth point is where they have the systems available, what data have we required them to provide in the agreement? Like what are the metrics points that they're required to provide after they've expanded their systems and have the ability to provide it? How long in the future is that? And are there penalties associated with not providing the data to allow us to determine if metrics are being met?
Penalties. Every jurisdiction in the agreement commits to providing an annual report, which contains how they have met their space creation targets, metrics on for-profit versus not-for-profit ratio, metrics on ECEs, workforce, wage grids, so a number of things. And they are also to provide an audited financial statement of the previous year. So we do get an annual report of the previous year as well as an audited financial statement. Failure to provide the annual report can result in a delay in the payment for the existing fiscal year to be issued. There have been cases when there's been a delay in payment to a jurisdiction for not having provided their annual report. It's not a decision we would take lightly. Families are depending on the investment to provinces and territories. However, that mechanism is very much in place, and it also applies to failure to provide an audited financial statement.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Mr. Lemire pour...
Mr. Lemire, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you very much. In the Auditor General's report, she asks ESDC to do more follow-up, more monitoring. The program in Quebec is entirely the responsibility of Quebec, and the transfers of funds from the federal government has worked quite remarkably. Given this dashboard, families in Quebec have been able to achieve spaces, like Ms. Goodridge said earlier, non-subsidized spaces. But there may perhaps be the possibility to hire to hire an extra teacher, which would mean that, say, we have another space, if the space moves from 5 to 6, and that gives an opportunity to another child, and you have those who are there to lend the money, but I'm always very vigilant because it is always very difficult for the federal government to trust what a given province is doing. Are there specific elements that are requested of each province? Are they uniform? You said earlier that it was very difficult for the federal government to place trust in the administration of monies. Are you getting goodwill from the provinces? I could begin, and then I could reiterate this. Each province had a different departure point for the program, a different start point. And so there were differences in the agreements, as has been mentioned already. We do have common indicators for all the provinces and territories for the overall objectives. But I just want to know this. Is everybody satisfied, or is that old federal reflex still in place where you can't trust a decentralized model to work? It's a hybrid model with federal investments and common objectives. It is an agreement that has been negotiated with each province and territory, and there is a will to respond. There is a requirement, rather, for the response from each province. They have to administer a program that provides details that corresponds with the details of their agreement. So it's a common goal for all the country, but there is flexibility in terms of administration of the program for each province. Next, Mr. Dutel, 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. I would like to thank you, all of you, for the quality of your French. I congratulate you. Mr. Lemire, I'm sure, would join me in my saying so. Ms. Hogan, there is a sentence in your report that we see very often in your reports. We have noted that the provincial governments and territorial governments, with the exception of the government of Quebec, etc., precisely in this instance, because Quebec has had its agreement in place for about 30 years now. And as Mr. Lemire pointed out, it was created in 97, and then Ms. Freeland moved it on a federal level. But it is a program that could be provincial, 100% provincial, and could be administered by the provinces themselves. Why not? Well, I think it's quite clear that early childhood education and child care is a program administered by the provinces. It's very clear, of course, that the federal program is coming from a very different place than the other provincial programs. But for most of the country, it was very necessary because of the higher cost of paying for the spaces. Yes, there was a federal transfer, if you like, to the provinces of funding, but it is up to the provinces to account for that money. So it's difficult for us to say if there was improvement because of federal funding or not. But the fact is, Quebec has a structure which is very different from the other provinces of the country. On paragraph 18, page 12, you say that we haven't determined for the cost for the government of Quebec because there's no requirement for an annual report with respect to the federal funding. So, from ocean to ocean, it can be different. I've never been somebody who wants one size fits all. I think it should be inspiration should be drawn from the best practices, not just for the provinces, but for the sectors as well. For example, the CPE at Saint-Urbain in Montreal, Quebec, the requirements are different for what type of system is found in the regions of Quebec. So what best practice, Ms. Hogan, can you recommend that could be put in place and could be applied for spaces in childcare systems? I think my colleagues are probably better placed to answer that, but I can tell you that from coast to coast, it is very different. It's individuality, the individuality and the needs of each province is recognized in the agreements. Is it because it's a best practice, or is it just the way they operate? I think the reality really is different from province to province in each province. I don't know if there's anybody who'd like to add anything, but we really didn't approach a review of the agreements from that perspective. There are 5 targets in the legislation, how the government is going to provide accountability to Canadians about the way in which they spent the money, and also the net new spaces. In some provinces, that was the case, and not the case in other provinces. So I think there are some measures that could be corrected to have more consistent and uniform practices throughout the country. So we can say that we created the 250,000 new spaces in Canada. Yes, but is it an intrusion by the federal government in each province and territory, or is it just something that is indicated to help the provinces? Mr. Lemire might say one thing, I would say another. The way I see it is that there's a Canadian daily reality. No matter what province you live in, people who live in cities can drop the kids off at a space that is on their way to work. But when you are in a rural environment, it's quite different. I live there, and there are people that are very happy to live there. But in the suburbs or in the city center, in the core of the city, it is very different. And Mr. Dutel, question. How do you reconcile these differing realities to help people? That's where the flexibility comes in. They can decide, people can decide where the province creates the new spaces. It is up to the provinces. It's not the federal government that's going to make that decision. There are different needs if it's in a rural or an urban area. Thank you so much.
Ms. Yip, you have the floor.
Thank you for doing this very important report. I'm glad all of you are here to answer our questions. Ms. Hogan, what is meant by inclusive spaces?
That's actually an area where we noticed that there was different definitions across the provinces and territories on what would be an inclusive space, and that's why it was difficult to sit back and globally say across the country whether inclusive spaces had been created. One of the requirements that we would have expected to see was whether or not there was more inclusive places based on sort of the per capita, the amount of children that were there. That information wasn't gathered. Whether or not those spaces were filled by families that were actually intended, again, information that was not gathered. So we saw this as an opportunity where there could have been a little bit more comparability put across the country if you wanted to report on this. So it was one of the outcomes, and so you should set out some key measures in order to check whether or not you met that outcome.
So why is it important for the provinces and territories to ensure eventual equitable access to regulated childcare spaces?
Well, usually this would mean families who may have been with lower income or families who had children who had special needs, and at times that would mean there are other expenses needed in a childcare if you need extra help or different tools. So again, all things that the provinces need to figure out and define. But if the goal is just simply creating more inclusive spaces and making sure they're used, the federal government had to figure out the metrics to measure that. Right?
Mr. Thompson, what steps are being taken to ensure equitable access for diverse and vulnerable families, including those in rural and remote areas?
Thank you for the question. Maybe starting out with your earlier question on inclusive spaces, I would just note that that's an important pillar in the legislation to lay out the objective of supporting inclusive spaces and the expansion and operation of an inclusive ELCC system, whether that's official language minority communities or Indigenous communities. That's laid out as a legislative parameter. There are also explicit objectives in our infrastructure agreements where funding is targeted to advance those objectives. And in the recent extension agreements that we've negotiated with provinces for the next 5 years, there's increased emphasis on the reporting around inclusion metrics around meeting some of the needs for different communities. So those are some of the measures that we've got in place.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson, could you comment on the data discrepancies as the provinces started from different places?
Indeed. As I said, an easier way to make early progress was on the affordability part of this in terms of providing greater subsidies. So we saw early progress, and that progress was noted in the Auditor General's report. The harder lift, if you will, was on the expansion of the childcare spaces themselves. Some provinces were starting from a very low position. Others would have had a higher level of space creation already, perhaps had more momentum. So there were some provinces that were starting from an earlier starting point and without a lot of momentum. So there's quite a variety of circumstances that were met in terms of reaching the expansion programs. There was also a little bit of a difference in terms of the signing on, timing and signing on of the agreements. Ontario, for example, signed on quite later. So there's variation in terms of the time at which different jurisdictions signed on. So those are a few of the factors that influenced the rate of space creation in the different provinces.
Okay. So I'll continue asking you, Mr. Thompson. One of the risks identified is that for most provincial and territory governments, ESDC did not assess whether the increase of educators who fully met certification requirements. With the increased demand for educators and the fact that they need to be certified, how can we be sure that they will meet the full requirements and that shortcuts won't be taken?
A few points on this. As I said, this has been a collective objective of the federal and provincial territorial governments to advance quality and to do so in the form of a workforce strategy. So that has entailed issues like wage grids and benefits, where there's been some progress. There's been also good discussion on competencies. This is more complicated because each province, coming back to provincial jurisdiction, they have jurisdiction over the the occupational competencies and requirements. So we're not looking at a complete harmonization, but more of a sharing of best practices on what constitutes good quality standards. So I would say as a result of our process, there's much more dialogue between provinces and territories on issues of certification and best practices in that space. I mentioned that we had a 30% increase in the workforce, so that is very encouraging. Maybe one last thing I would note, 2 other measures the federal government has put in place. We're in the process of rolling out $7.5 million through our sectoral workforce solutions program to support the development of competencies across the country, so to work with partners on advancing labor market information, competency assessment, and issues like that to facilitate growth of the workforce. I would also note that the Canada Student Loan Forgiveness, as per the last budget, is being expanded to include early childhood educators that move to remote, certified early childhood educators who move to remote areas. They can see a portion of their student loan forgiven with that's one of the expanded occupations to which that applies. So there are a few things the federal government is doing, but this is also a deep area of provincial expertise, and we're trying to really work a lot on dialogue and collaboration.
Thank you. That is your time, Ms. Shipp. Beginning our third round, going back to Ms. Goodridge, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the pieces that I think is the most flawed in this system is the fact that the federal government really limited the amount of spaces available to entrepreneurs. Specifically in my home province of Alberta, you put caps so that we couldn't expand childcare. And so that has meant that childcare operators are primarily women, so women entrepreneurs have been left out and are sitting there struggling. And this means that families don't have access to care because these programs, we have childcare spaces that are existing, but they're not able to access this grant because of arbitrary caps put on by the federal government. And so why was there such a focus on limiting access to these spectacular female entrepreneurs in expanding these businesses that already existed in many cases?
That's
to you, Mr. Thompson.
Yeah. Okay. just checking. Thank you for the question. On the for-profit sector, it was certainly the policy intent of this investment to support the expansion primarily of the not-for-profit sector. There was not a prohibition on expanding the for-profit sector. It was
put caps in place, very, very strict caps.
The policy objective was that the not-for-profit sector should grow at a faster rate than the for-profit sector with the investment. So both could grow, but the ratio is expected to shift more heavily towards not-for-profit. That was the policy objective. I would make 2 other observations. One, home operators were excluded from the definition of for-profit. So if you're operating out of your home, you're not considered for-profit.
If you have a really small business, you're excluded. But if you have like a 30-kid daycare and have a few employees, that's the problem. But let's have these big, giant, not-for-profit daycares in large centers. That's a-okay. But like the part that really hits me hard is I live in a rural community. I represent a rural riding. We're not talking about large centers by and large. We're talking about small centers. And those small centers are generally served by owner-operators. And your guys' systems completely left those out. And that, to me, is a huge issue. And then I think one of the other pieces that I want to hit on is I'm incredibly proud to represent Fort Wayne Cold Lake and the amazing men and women that serve in the Canadian Armed Forces there. The child care deals, as they are currently written, do not meet the flexibility requirements to serve the parents that have children that are serving our country, serving our national security needs, because they don't typically work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and they often need outside care. And these deals have left these families in Cold Lake completely out in the cold. So what is your government doing to make sure that families that are serving our country are actually able to get the flexible care they desperately need?
So a few points on that. First of all, as I said, there's no prohibition on for-profit expansion. It can be done. And there's nothing to stop provinces from making additional investments.
That's not accurate because because in my province of Alberta, they are actually limited in
ratio.
There's a ratio. So you have limited the number of spaces that can be created because you guys have set an arbitrary number, not understanding the reality on the ground in Alberta.
But that ratio only applies to the federal investment. As I mentioned, provinces have invested quite significantly in this as well, and
I'm very proud of my province of Alberta for stepping up when the federal government decided to set arbitrary limits.
To make that investment as well, and they are making that investment. The latitude for private operators also includes, and this is a consensus amongst provinces and territories, looking at the guardrails, making sure you got financial controls that need to be a bit more robust in the case of private operators. Quality
assurances. That's really frustrating to these operators that are stuck in these systems that inflation that's been out of control has hit them hard, and they are struggling to make ends meet, and you guys continue blaming these amazing female entrepreneurs, these owner-operators, and to me that's absolutely not okay, and I will stand up against this every single day. Ms. Hogan, could you perhaps explain to us how flexibility is being measured, and are they actually meeting the needs of these parents that need outside care? Because I know in your report it very clearly states that there are not guardrails in place to make sure that the flexible care is being met.
Mm-hmm. Many of your questions point to policy choices, and those are not things that, as you know, that my office will comment on. We comment on the implementation of the policy choice that have been made. When it came to flexibility, again, I think it's an area where there was very little parameters put out for the government to be able to report back on flexibility. And I think it was just given to the provinces as saying, you understand your needs and you set them, and there were certain criteria, as the Deputy Minister talked about, around increasing regulated spaces in the not-for-profit sector, which were policy choices that had been made. And the rest of the flexibility about where funding went specifically was left with the provinces to make.
I'm afraid that is your time. Up next is Ms. Tester-Dirksen for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and thanks so much for coming in. This speaks really personally to me, this topic. I have 4 children. They're young adults now, but for years when I was going to school after university and my husband was starting up a small business, childcare was something that caused us a lot of anxiety, a lot of sleepless nights, and having reliable, affordable, accessible childcare is extremely important in my community. I'm sure communities all across the country. So I appreciate the work you're doing in assessing how the government is delivering this program. And I do want to start off by noting that to the Auditor General, the conclusion of your report basically finds that ESDC had fulfilled its responsibilities to support the quality, affordability, access, inclusion, and flexibility of early learning and childcare centres across Canada, which is good. Thank you for that. But there's critiques, of course, and recommendations, and they seem to really focus on the theme of the lack of the ability to assess the effectiveness of the program because of these data gaps that we keep bringing up in our questions. So I understand the jurisdictional realities. You know, the program allows provinces and territories to allocate funds at their discretion. That's perfectly understandable. But I'm noting that's resulting in some limited or inconsistent information that's being gathered, which is hindering our ability to assess whether or not this program is actually meeting its goals. I do note on paragraph 23, so on page 12, the report notes that the funding agreements require provincial and territorial governments to report annually, if able, on several elements, including information about unmet demand. If able is a rather powerful qualifier. So I'm wondering if you could provide some comment on what the rationale was for including that type of discretion in the agreements.
I believe that would be a question best asked to the Deputy Minister, but listening to his previous responses, I think it would talk about reflecting that provinces all started in very different places. Some had very robust systems and some didn't, and some would not have even a global picture in the province around regulated spaces. Each organization would have that information, but I'm seeing Deputy Minister Thompson nod his head in agreement with me.
I could just add that provinces, again, coming at it from different starting points with different data systems. I would say scale of provincial operations is also an issue. Ontario, for example, having a very large, complicated system much larger than some other jurisdictions, so the ability to collect data varied widely across provinces and territories, and very few had a centralized waiting list capability to know how many waiting lists an individual parent might be on, and therefore what's the actual number of parents not able to access childcare is a data point that we wish we had more insights on, but has not been available in most cases.
Thank you. So building off that point, is there potential to not renegotiate, but amend these types of agreements, or if we do extending agreements, to build in that kind of specificity so that we can be more customized when we're dealing with specific provinces based on their ability to collect this data, but making sure they're collecting the data to the best of their ability?
There are indeed opportunities to do that. I mentioned that we've got a very active federal provincial working group that is looking at different ways of collecting the data. Coming back to the point made earlier about sharing best practices, this is an area where some provinces and territories have more innovative ways of doing this, and we are seeing dialogue and interest in sharing some of the capabilities that might exist in. They might even just replicate a system and transport it to another area, so that's an area of promise. And I would say in our extension agreements, we've got a renewed and bolstered commitment to work together on better reporting as well. So it's reflected in legislation, in new agreements, and I certainly see a will with provinces to work together on improving it.
Okay, that's great. And just kind of following along that theme, what types of responses have we been getting from provinces in general about the program, about the effectiveness of it, or how the ease of the implementation of the program requirements? Have we gotten feedback from provinces individually?
Well, we work very regularly. I certainly meet with my deputy minister counterparts at least three times a year. I've got a meeting with them in a month's time, so there's regular opportunity for dialogue. Some of this relates to the status of agreements and funding, but a lot of it relates to dialogue that wasn't happening previously on just how we can operate collectively a better childcare system. So it's basically a forum to share some of these practices and build a system together that operates out of a federal framework with funding, but allows latitude for provinces to meet some of their specific needs on the ground.
Okay, but generally it's well received by the provinces and they're eager to continue and to build the programs.
They're all enthusiastic participants. As I say, there's 3 provinces that were in the process of finalizing extension agreements, so I would take that all the others that have signed on are enthusiastic about continuing the work together, and we're very close on this remaining 3 provinces to have a renewed commitment as well. So that's a pretty good indicator of their interest in continuing in the program.
Good to hear, because in some ways...
You can just make it a quick, you're over your time, but you're on a roll, but if you have a short wrap-up, please go ahead.
Yeah, because in some ways the program has been a victim of its own success because there is some unmet demand. I know I was reading an article just the other day about the province of Manitoba. There's some criticisms about the ability to staff to roll out more spaces. So I just adding that onto my comments. You don't have to respond. Thank you.
Any response to that? You don't have to, but...
I think I've answered.
Okay, thank you. All right. Suivant encore une fois, Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Lemire, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Last turn. Well, I feel the passion that's in the air today with all the interveners. We are all very concerned about the early childhood education of our children. Ms. Hogan, you said that there wasn't enough stringency or funding for the First Nations. Could you tell us what you've done about that? What work have you done with respect to that? Is there data? How does it operate? That's a space in a report where it was a little bit more difficult to include ESDC, because there were also programs that existed but were administered by other departments. We wanted to improve the spaces for the Indigenous children, and the department that is supposed to deal with that horizontally, we expected that the department would have much more information. We thought there would be targets, but once again, it's the same comment and the same recommendation as with respect to the rest of the country. Is there room for improvement? An example is something about, say, improving structures that would allow the federal government to find out exactly how many buildings or how many renovations or extensions of space were made available. Well, in the Quebec context, we know that in 21, Quebec is set up additional new spaces. There are 4,500 available in Quebec, but with respect to Indigenous children, is there something that can be done? Does Quebec have its fair share of the spaces that would be becoming available? Well, really, I think it's Mr. Thompson that should be answering this. For the past decade, we've been trying to. They have been trying to develop a co-development plan, and with communities, with third parties, Indigenous third parties. But perhaps Mr. Thompson could add something to this. Yes, I can. Perhaps that would help my colleague. There are a lot, many Indigenous communities that depend on the existing programs, 3 that fall under the Canada Health and others under ESDC, our own department. So new investments were agreed for the continuation of the programs in these communities. But the way in which the programs are developed is co-developed, or delivered rather, is co-developed with the partners. And there has been an increase in investment at the table, 60 at the bargaining table now to negotiate the co-development and how to establish the priorities, the performance framework. We are advancing, perhaps a bit more slowly than we had hoped, but we are moving forward with respect to the Indigenous investment. We need the participation of the Indigenous communities, and we are near to developing a program framework. Thank you.
Cousy, encore une fois pour 5 minutes.
Ms. Cousy, 5 minutes.
Madame Hogan, vous avez parlé des risques spécifiques selon les...
As though the government has met their guiding principles with this program or not.
Audit showed that the federal funding led to improvements. I think the most noticeable would be in affordability. There's definitely been a decline in the costs for childcare per day, and there's definitely been a creation of spaces. But what's missing is whether or not the government, by the end of 2026, will be able to show that all of those goals have been missing because there's gaps in information. So there's a failure in making sure that you've set yourself up to get that information, but it's clear that the funding has helped make childcare more affordable across the country.
Okay. In your view, do you believe ESDC has properly tracked and kept data to assess whether or not the government will meet its guiding principles?
I believe most of our testimony today has been around exactly that, a gap missing. There's a key recommendation about gathering better information. I think when it's easier to track number of spaces, it's hard to know whether they're being used. It's hard to know whether they're inclusive, whether they're being, the right families are using those spaces. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement on data gathering and reporting.
Is there any other program that has been created and implemented by this government that you could use as a comparison, or alternatively a principle of IFSR that would be applicable here in terms of the fund delivery for the outcome?
Oh, I mean, that's a very difficult question for me to look at. There are so many programs across the government, and I think this is, I think some of the findings that we're finding here about the need to establish how to measure when you're in a space where it's regulated by a province. We're seeing that in other programs. We saw it in gathering health information during the pandemic. You see it in housing. So I think there needs to be a way for the federal government to work out better reporting and exchange mechanisms with the provinces and territories, because often there is a commingling of federal money, provincial money, municipal money, and how do we talk to Canadians about a program on a national level when you don't have good information sharing agreements for all of these programs. So I think there's an opportunity for all levels of government to be able to show Canadians how money's being spent in a better way.
I agree. And in addition to the example I gave earlier about the pipeline MOU, which is supposed to be announced today, I'm actually thinking of another example within my city, specifically that the government is going to withhold funding for housing should they decide to repeal the blanket rezoning. So it's really, it comes with strings attached. It's not, this is for the good of your community and what you decide. It has to adhere to things. In 3 instances, you note the Employment and Social Development Canada, either did not effectively assess or mislead opportunities to monitor expected outcomes of the program. Why do you think that is?
Again, it speaks to that recommendation around not, at the design of this, really thinking about how to gather comparable and consistent information across the country, recognizing that everybody was starting in a slightly different place. So how do you elevate it to be able to talk consistently? And I think it's just not having that data, and at times collecting some of that data, but then not consolidating it to talk about the global picture that they have. So I think there's 2 elements that contribute to not being able to demonstrate.
Do you believe that ESDC has the tools to monitor these arrangements currently?
Well, all of the agreements clearly call for the exchange of information. And as was mentioned earlier, there is an annual report that's required, and funding can be delayed until that report is received. And we definitely saw that happening. But I think the focus needs to be is on the content of what's in there, so that you can get some more consistent and comparable information from all the provinces to speak nationally about the program.
But why would you think that the government signed individual agreements with provinces and territories, knowing the areas they wanted to track, without receiving guarantees that they would be able to receive that information from the provinces and territories? That's tied into my first round.
Well, I think all of the agreements talked about the need to exchange information, but it wasn't to the level of exactly what. And I think some of the agreements recognized, and we had a conversation just earlier from another question saying, provide information if able, recognizing that some provinces just didn't have the robustness or the maturity of a system right now. And how do you support them in getting that so that you can get national information? So I think there's a lot of parameters in place. But this is possibly an area that we see in many programs, right? Forgetting to think about exactly what we need to show outcomes. It's not just about metrics, right? It's about really the end game. And I think inclusivity and flexibility are great things. It's easy to measure number of spaces, hard to measure something that's a little less concrete, right? And so you have to think that through at the start.
Thank you very much. Going back to you, Mr. Osborne, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Follow-up to the department, the missed opportunity as identified in the AG report to monitor report effectively and to monitor the progress nationally. Can you walk us through what, if any, steps you've put in place either prior to the report being completed or since the report to improve that?
Absolutely. I guess I would first point out to the fact that I think, as noted, there was not an absence of data collection. We do have quite a reliable set of data on space creation, very good indicators on affordability, and those were some of the initial objectives. I think what the AG has pointed out is that there's a need for much more granularity on meeting some of the more nuanced objectives of the program, and we're fully committed to doing that. I mentioned the legislation establishes proper reporting as a key feature of this. We have, it's the top, if not one of the top priorities of the Deputy Minister and Minister working groups. So my Minister Haidu, meets regularly with her counterparts. I meet with the deputies, and there's a data working group. So there's a lot of work on lifting all the boats to have a much better collective reporting system. I mentioned that just in the last week, we've launched a new portal, which would be a consolidated space to provide Canadians information on the review. The Auditor General noted there were two issues. One was collecting the information, and the second was assembling and making available. On that second issue, we are committed to assembling faster and posting in a much clearer fashion through this portal that we have the information that's available. There are a bit more limitations on what we can collect because that's a provincial capacity issue, but as I noted, we're working on that aspect as well.
Okay. So in the report, it also indicated that the department did not update its approaches to measure results, to collect information on progress towards some planned actions. Have you addressed this, or if not, what do you plan to do to update the results in measurement approaches?
Thank you for the question. I'm just trying to. What Indigenous early learning and childcare. Thank you for that clarification. So, as I mentioned on that front, in relation to the last question, the Indigenous investments, we wanted to maintain a balance between three existing programs on which communities depended. So we wanted to keep going and providing the supports through those programs. But at the same time, we're trying to shift to a new delivery model, co-developed with Indigenous partners. This has taken us a little more time than we had hoped for, but that arises from our commitment to doing it in a co-developed way. We have 60 partnership tables with Indigenous organizations across the country, distinctions-based, to try to come up with a performance framework that meets the needs of those communities, so puts them at the center of the delivery of the programs. We are very close. We have some final steps in terms of getting Indigenous leadership approval, but at the officials level, we've made very good progress on a performance framework that would be used by the distinctions-based partnership tables across the country.
I want to reflect a little on a question that a colleague across the table had asked regarding service folks and some of our national defence sites. I know in Newfoundland and Labrador, one of the initiatives that we did, for example, is a new hospital was announced. After I had moved from education, I went into health. We announced a new hospital. As part of that, that building is going to include an early learning and childcare centre focused on, and through the program, focused on catering to the needs of healthcare professionals. So it won't be a 9 to 5. It reflects the actual work life of healthcare professionals. Is there a way, and I know that FPT meetings happen, but is there a way where we can share best results from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction so that things like this may translate into helping on a national defence site or at a hospital if it's a new build, for example? So we've adopted the policy that any new hospitals built have to contain within the bricks and mortar the space for early learning and childcare catering to healthcare professionals.
So that is a really important and rich question. There are a number of dimensions to it. I didn't get a chance to complete my earlier answer on reference to national defence. As you may know, there's a very significant investment, $100 million, to expand childcare services within the Department of National Defence. We are collaborating with D&D on that. I've had conversations with my counterpart. In fact, I invited her to present to the provinces, to your point, on so that D&D could benefit from the wisdom of running childcare centres that exist in the provinces and vice versa. So there is that exchange in rolling out different childcare supports. Some of those same needs that you were referring to in the Canadian Forces in terms of demand for childcare outside of normal hours. We see that in a whole bunch of other areas too, major projects. I've seen companies that are interested in major projects really leaning in on doing childcare planning. They can't attract a workforce unless there's childcare supports. So this idea of designing childcare delivery to meet the needs of atypical hours, atypical schedules is critical. I think it's recognized, and it is an area of, that would benefit from even more sharing of best practices.
It is available, though, in the funding, at least maybe not with all provinces. I'm not privy to agreements with other provinces, but with our province, we were able to access the funding under that program, which will in turn help us attract healthcare professionals in recruiting, because we're offering the service that they need.
Indeed, it's not only enabled by the agreements, it's encouraged, and that's the kind of thing that we would really enjoy seeing in action plans. That what does each province plan to do to meet some of these atypical needs that might exist in rural, remote areas, as was referred to earlier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Osborne. That is our time. We're going to have a truncated last round with 3 members. We'll hear from the official opposition, the Bloc, and then the government will close things out. I just have a quick comment, since it's come up, and something that you could look into. The daycare, the child care facility for national defense here in Ottawa. My wife's in the forces. It's not located at the D&D HQ. One thing our personnel does not do is complain. So I'm going to complain on their behalf today. Daycare has to be located where the men and women who lace up their boots every morning to defend this country go to work. There's no point putting it halfway across town when the men and women then have to drive almost to Canada to go to work every single day. So I'll leave that with you, Mr. Thompson, to raise with the CDS or whoever your counterpart is on the military side. Location is key, which I know my colleague Ms. Goodrich will agree with. And on that note, Ms. Goodrich, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. And I think this is one of the big struggles that we are facing. But one of the questions I have, I know Ontario put out their Auditor General report where they highlight the fact that 27% of the spaces that are created are not being filled. So are we, Mr. Thompson, do you know how many spaces across the country aren't being filled that have been created?
I don't have perfect data on utilization rates. It would vary from province to province. This has been a discussion with Ontario on their utilization rates, since it was fairly well documented in the Ontario Auditor General report. So they have commitments that will be part of the extension agreement, not only a space creation, but also a utilization commitment.
Well, and I think this is the part that really frustrates a lot of parents. We have thousands of parents that I've talked to that are waiting on lists. They have no availability to any kind of flexible, affordable, any kind of care. They take the first care that's available because they've been waiting on lists for so long that there is no what works for their family. They're literally taking the only thing that they can get. And oftentimes it's not what works for their family. And then to hear that there are spaces being created and that aren't being filled is infuriating. So, what things other than we don't have the data are you guys actually taking action on to make sure that spaces are being matched to the people that need them?
Yeah. So I would say the action plans that are done with the province need a complementary workforce plan. One of the major constraints to space creation is the availability of early childhood educators. I mentioned we've seen significant growth, 30%. I don't think that is sufficient yet to meet the goals that we have. So there's further growth of the early childhood educator space. It's being encouraged by the wage growth, the wage grids that exist. That's a big way of attracting more people in. But I would say that's one of the biggest barriers to utilization, is ensuring you've got sufficient staff to run a childcare facility.
Well, but I think it's also making sure that the facility is being built in a place where the needs actually are. Has there been any kind of needs assessment as to which communities have childcare deserts? We know that there are places that have childcare deserts, and I'm going to go on the record here saying Cold Lake, Alberta, the home of Four Wing, Canada's premier air base, is a desert when it comes to childcare. We have families that are serving our armed forces that cannot find care. I'm not bringing this up because I'm the member of parliament for Fort McMurray Cold Lake. I'm bringing this up because this is absolutely atrocious. And we do not have flexible childcare. We do not have childcare available outside of Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 in that community. How are we asking fighter pilots that are going on deployment all across? And this is just one example. There are hundreds of examples at bases all across this country. How are we not providing flexible care so that these people that are put in isolated postings, away from their family, away from their support structures, have access to the care they need?
So I noted the significant investments D&D is making in collaborating to designing a responsive...
Haven't made. So families right now, today, are making impossible decisions because we have been 3 years into this, and they're only just now maybe starting to think about this.
Well, I was going to finish my answer and note that the current agreements encourage the creation of spaces that meet the community needs. That's up to the provinces to decide in their action plans. Where they're encouraged to do that, we would welcome it in action plans if they were to respond to those needs. And the last thing I would say, I wouldn't interpret a low utilization rate to be a sign of no demand in that community. It's more often a case of insufficient staffing to keep the space open. So it's constraints like that that are leading to a low utilization rate.
I appreciate
rather than the absence of demand in that area.
But you don't have the data to actually tell you which ones are because there's low staffing and which ones are because there's just no need. We also don't have any of this data. Like we're going off of StatsCan data. Your department doesn't collect any of this. That seems like there's a huge gap there. The fact that there is no space, like we know some parents that are on hundreds of wait lists and they still can't get in. There is no flexible care. I know families that are choosing other childcare forms simply because the only childcare available in their community is not flexible enough for the needs so that they can actually do the job. That's a problem. That is a huge problem. And so I think the next question, we know that it costs more money to provide care to children that have different needs and special needs. What is being done to ensure that low-income and special needs kids actually can get those care?
That, too, would be an element to prioritize in action plans. I don't know, Catherine, if you want to elaborate on how those needs are reflected in the agreements.
Yep, we do ask that there be with each agreement every year an action plan that the provinces do to demonstrate what they're going to allocate to space creation, what they're going to prioritize in terms of spaces in childcare deserts, inclusion of low-income families, being able to look at where there's high-need areas, socioeconomic demographics, to be able to determine where they will want to incent, build, create spaces. So every province does do that in their action plans that they provide to us, to be able to demonstrate what their plan is to do with the money for the year. It's a really important piece that I would say I've heard from every province and territory, being able to make sure that they are able to meet need. There are no doubt challenges. Rural areas can be challenged for the creation of spaces. They're more expensive quite often. It's also in large city centers where rent for a childcare facility can be higher. So there's always these balances that provinces are looking at making. There are challenges that you've raised that are well acknowledged, and I would say all my discussions with provinces and territories validate that they are looking at how they can improve this.
Thank you.
Did you close your laser? Are you Ms. Goodrich, you have a last comment?
Well, I think it's good to hear that you guys acknowledge this, but it sounds like you aren't actually doing things to help the families that are struggling right now, and you're putting a lot of blame on provinces when you guys created a system and didn't actually create the metrics to be able to tell parents what was going on. That seems like a massive flaw to create a system without actually having any metrics for measurement. Can you commit that you'll do better in future agreements and things where you're stepping into provincial jurisdiction?
Order. if you like, last comment, and then I'll move on to our next witness.
I think I've stated our commitment to do better on data reporting, also noting that I think we have some meaningful indicators already, 125,000 new spaces created as of November, and very significant evidence on the affordability side, but fully accept the responsibility for bringing more granularity and more precision to some of the broader objectives of the program. Absolutely.
Merci beaucoup. Suivant, c'est Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Next. Mr. Lemire, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to speak about a project in my region, Abitibi-Témiscamingue. The CPE Mingan set up an undertaking, an Anishinaabe undertaking, where there is the participation of Indigenous children and also children coming from other areas who are new to Canada. There are activities that are organized according to the Anishinaabe calendar seasons, and they have these special experiences that are, for example, an autumn experience for the young children, one for the spring, and so on. Quebec is funding this undertaking by itself. We know that there is the different federal program that you spoke about earlier, but Quebec has acted because of this important cultural program. Why couldn't this not be done elsewhere? In Quebec, there is work that is done, accountable work that is done with the Anishinaabe, with Indigenous people, with the Inuit. Why couldn't that be done elsewhere? That sounds like a very impressive program. I don't understand the details or know the details of the funding of the program, but I can reiterate that we work in close cooperation with the communities to see what can be done. Maybe we could perhaps explore further what could be done with the various tables, the 60 tables, participatory bargaining tables that I mentioned earlier. I see your passion, I hear it, and I'm very impressed by it. But it can create confusion because the Quebec programs are working. When you multiply all these negotiating tables at the community level, and yet there are the Quebec programs, the standalone ones, that work very well. With respect to Indigenous participation, there is a very significant participation between the federal government and the communities. There are obligations that exist, and there are the self-governing First Nation treaty holders. I ask for your understanding. I don't know all the terms in French, but we've always recognized this very important relationship with our Indigenous partners. There are these 3 programs that have been in place for a long time with our very important clients that depend on the programs. So it's difficult to create any disturbance in the programs that might endanger the delivery of services. Given the existing relationships and the obligations that exist vis-a-vis the Indigenous communities. Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you, sir.
You have the floor for approximately 5 minutes, and you'll be the last member to pose questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, what level of government is responsible for the location of child care spaces?
Early learning and child care is a provincial and territorial regulated area.
So they would be responsible for the actual locations.
That would be my understanding. I don't audit the provinces and territories, but that would be my understanding, yes.
Thank you. Did your audit identify any best practices among provinces or territories that could accelerate space creation?
It's interesting because I'm just about, I said I don't audit the provinces and territories. I don't audit the provinces. I do audit the territories. So we're actually just looking into lining up our early childhood learning care audits for our territories so that we can speak to that. I unfortunately don't have any information about that. I don't know if the department does, so I couldn't really speak to that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Mr. Thompson? Any comments on that?
We're in constant dialogue with the provinces and territories on the challenges of creating and expanding childcare. There also is a ministerial advisory council of childcare experts, which informs us too of some of the on-the-ground realities around the challenges of operating, expanding. So we've got multiple sources of information on some of the challenges, and that's why there have been a range of program investments to try to deal with some of them, whether it's workforce issues, and I mentioned some of those measures. There's been a need for infrastructure supports, and we've dealt with that through some dedicated investments. So it is really through dialogue with the provinces that these barriers have been identified, and we've worked to try to create different solutions.
Is it that same task force or advisory council that's also working on harmonization of standards between the provinces and territories that you mentioned earlier?
The advisory council I was referring to is the name right? The ministers.
The National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare.
There we go. That's the proper name. I meet with them, but I forget what they're called. And in fact, we're meeting again very soon. So that is really an advisory on the pan-Canadian system. More the individual advice on space creation really comes from the provinces and territories in terms of their own needs.
Okay. Ms. Hogan, the several provincial and territory governments reported to the department about limitations in their abilities to collect and report data related to diverse or vulnerable children and families for early learning and childcare, and we're exploring options to overcome these limitations. Why were there difficulties in collecting the data, and how can the provinces and territories overcome these limitations?
Again, a question that I don't think I'm in a good position to answer. The reason we were trying to explore that and see what the federal government was gathering in that vein is that the Act called for 5 guiding principles, and one of them was to look at inclusivity. And so we think that if you want to have 5 principles, then you should set yourself up to have information to report on outcomes and achievements or progress made towards those principles. I'm hopeful that we can try and provide some insights in the territories. And I do know, because this was a provincially regulated program, I did discuss the early childhood with my provincial counterparts, and it was in that dialogue that the Auditor General of Ontario took on her report. Another province had already done one, and 2 other provinces are going to complete some in the coming year. And it was so that we could, as Auditors General, help support a dialogue that looked national. Nationally. So hopefully there'll be other provinces that can provide insights to provinces that are working on improving how they report data, how they gather data, and how they interact with the federal government when it comes to this program.
So my last question to both of you is the recommendation about, or the risk rather, identified about the financial sustainability of the program beyond 2026. Could you elaborate and perhaps provide some advice on that?
I can happily start and then leave it to Deputy Minister Thompson. I think provinces raised concerns about financial sustainability. I think it's clear if you look at the Auditor General of Ontario's report that there are parties involved in paying for daycare. There's families. There's the provincial government, could be municipalities, and then there's the federal government. And when one of those elements may not be guaranteed into the future, that obviously calls into question the financial viability of the program, because the burden then falls on the remainder of funding. So I think that it's a good question to think about. How much money will be needed, how long will funding will be needed, and what will be some of the terms and conditions linked to that funding. So this is a critical program, and so it's important to talk about it going into the future.
Yeah. Mr. Thompson?
So there's no doubt that there are some sustainability challenges ahead. But that being said, I think the government has indicated its ongoing commitment. As Catherine noted earlier, there's a legislative commitment to maintaining this program, recent funding for new 5-year agreements. So there's a commitment there. We do need to work with provinces, though, to find a pathway to provide that certainty for parents on the funding side of it, the fees that are paid by parents, the level of provincial support, the level of federal support. But really pleased that we've got agreement signed to get us in a good place for continuing the program over the next 5 years.
Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses for your testimony and participation in relation to this study of the report on the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system of the 2025 fall report to the Auditor General of Canada. Thank the witnesses again for coming in today. This meeting is adjourned. We'll be back here next Tuesday to return to professional services contracts. Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.